capabilities. WordPress has had a very open architecture since the very beginnings to let developers go in and be able to add capabilities. Now, these hooks or these ways for developers to be able to add content to WordPress have been growing over time, have been improving. The very first plugin that I wrote was a very short file, and it was very simple in what it did. And then, admin pages came in, shortcodes came in, and this whole ecosystem of different capabilities came in to make it very easy for developers to be able to put together some very rich plugins. Now, the size of a plugin's code and what it's going to do is really going to vary greatly from one plugin to another. Something could do just a very small change to how WordPress works, just change a little menu, add a little something on your install, or other things could completely overtake WordPress. One thing that's always nice about plugin is that functionality stays in place as you're changing themes. So we just discussed this with custom post types. If you're somebody like me who likes to change his theme every 6 months or so on a personal site, well, you don't want to have to go back to your theme, figure out what you added to the functions file, move that over to the new site. Same things with if you added extra code inside of your theme header, if you added all these extra elements, it's not very portable. So by using plugins that are going to perform these tasks, then you're sure that if you just flip the theme, all these different elements are going to stay in place. Now, plugins can be installed two ways. So one way would be to go under the admin, under the plugin page, search for the plugin you like, which is a great way of doing it, and install it right from there. Another way that's a bit more involved is to download the plugin from the WordPress site and then go in and upload it manually to your server. It gives you a bit more control over things, but in the end, it does the same thing. It gets the plugin files on your server, and then you can go and activate your plugin. So what makes up a plugin? And yeah, the sun is not helping me here on these slides. Plugins are made up from one or more PHP files. So if you don't know what PHP is, it's the programming language that's used to create WordPress. So WordPress runs in PHP, and so any plugin you create is going to be made up of at least one PHP file. That's the minimum. Then you might have other files that are going to be inside of your plugin. So you're going to have potentially images, potentially translation files. You might have readmes or other text files available in there that will make up your plugin. So all these will make up in the end what your plugin is. And thank you for people putting down the blinds. Now, a plugin can either be located directly under the WP Content plugin directory. Now, that's very few of them, or they can be in a subdirectory there. So there are a few plugins like a Kismet or Hello Dolly. Those come right into the root of the plugin folder. Most other plugins, though, they like to have their own directory. It makes more sense because you're going to be dealing with multiple files. The entry point to a plugin is a PHP file that's going to contain a specific header that WordPress will recognize, and from that header, it's going to be able to show you the plugin in the plugin page, let you activate and do all these things just from that basic information. So let's take a look at what that header looks like. The header is actually a comment. So you have here the beginning of a PHP tag, a little /* here saying this is a comment. Then you have a whole bunch of fields that just describe what the plugin is. So far, while this isn't too hard, I'm saying what's the name, what's the address of where this plugin will be hosted, what does it do, like a high-level description of your plugin, version, your name, your own address, and then the license. That last little one here, the license, that has to do with what kind of license are you publishing this plugin under. Typically, it's GPL2, which is the same license that's used in WordPress, but it could be potentially other types of licensing. So having this at the top of your first PHP file is going to register this plugin with WordPress. Most of this data is actually visible in the admin section. So if we took a look at it, just from having written this little piece of text, we get this wonderful box here. So that's already a good reward for this work that we've done. Now, of course, at this point, our plugin does absolutely nothing. We can activate it and deactivate it, and that's about it. But still, we can have our name next to Matt's, and that's already a good start. So a little bit of information about plugin evaluation rules. So first of all, any function that you declare in the plugin could be called from anywhere within WordPress. That means if you declare a function, it could be called from your theme. It could be called from another plugin. So that's the first thing to be aware of. Second one is that function names must be different from the WordPress core functions and from other plugins. If you don't, you're going to get into conflicts. You'll get messages that are going to start to pop up in your admin pages, potentially even on your site, saying, oh, there's two functions that are declared with the same name. So you want to make sure you avoid that. Typically you do that by having kind of your own name or the plugin's name in front of any function name you declare so that it's fairly unique to what you're doing. Now the next two here, big warning box, the entire content of your plugin is evaluated each time your site is rendered. So that's dangerous, meaning that a single error, a missing bracket, a missing semicolon, will just mean that your site will not render. It's going to stop, you'll get a big error message on there. So typically you want to use a local development environment to put together your site. The next talk in this room at 2 o'clock is all about doing that. So if you don't know how to set up your own dev environment, attend the next talk at 2. Now if you're wondering what it might look like if you break your site, well that's what it's going to look like. So if you forget anything in your code, you'll get this on your front page, on every single page of your site. So you want to be careful. Local dev environment is really good for this. So beyond just declaring functions and being able to call them anywhere, well that's not that powerful in itself. Where the power of WordPress comes in is from their ability to be able to register functions that are going to be called at specific points during the execution of your WordPress rendering, of your WordPress site. This is called hooking, and there's two basic types of hooks that you can register in WordPress. And no, you're not playing hooky, you're hooking things on your website. So first come the action hooks. So the action hooks will be triggers that are going to be called while WordPress is rendering the website. And so this will let you go and output extra code. So one of the most commonly known ones is WP head or WP footers. So these are some different things that are called within your theme as it's being rendered. And so as a plugin developer, you can hook into these and specify what you want to have happen when your website will be rendering the header or rendering its footer. The other type is what are called filter hooks. The filter hooks let you manipulate data in the site. So what that means is that as WordPress goes around and does all of its basic tasks, it's getting all of your posts from the database, it's getting your list of items that are going to go in your menu, all these different actions, it's going to give you a chance anywhere within these processes to go and manipulate the data. So it basically gives you the chance to go and register your own function, and then it's going to give you all the data that it's currently manipulating, and it's going to give you a chance to play with it. And then once you're done playing with it, then you can give it back to WordPress, and then it's going to put it up on your website. So that can give you some pretty interesting capabilities in terms of changing things around or figuring out what's going to happen on a site. So how do you deal with these different actions, or how do you hook your own functions? Well, the syntax you have here, so we have add action, so that's a general function that's available, and so the parameters would be your hook name. So the hook name is which hook in WordPress do you want to hook up to. Now there's a lot of these hooks that are available within WordPress. These are documented primarily in the codex. There's also other third-party sites that specialize in just putting together lists of all these different actions, although these are not as well documented. Now after you have your hook name, then you specify the function that you want to call. So that's your own function within your code that's going to be called when this action occurs. Now there's other parameters that are optional, priority and accepted arguments. The priority lets you specify what's the importance of this function compared to other ones that might be registered. So WordPress itself, if it registers an action hook, it's going to be high priority. Your default priority as a developer, if you don't specify it, is 10, 1 being the highest, but you could put 100 if you don't mind if your thing happens after everything else, or you specifically want your thing to happen after everything else. So a specific action would be here if you call add action WP head and then specify new GA header. You could have your own function new GA header be called when your WordPress theme calls WP head and gives you a chance to write things inside of the page header. Now I've just mentioned the codex and sites that have listings of actions. Another way to figure out what actions are available is actually to look at the source code of WordPress. Yes, that might be a bit scary for some. But if I look at the code for WP head, so this is what you put inside of your theme, the code is do action WP head. This is a straight copy paste from the WordPress source code. So if you're wondering what happens when you call WP head, that's what happens. It's going to execute any action that's been registered for the WP head action hook. Now if we looked at an implementation of an action hook, an example that I'm going to be running with through these different examples is, what if you wanted to do your own Google Analytics type of thing? So you wanted to have your own little plugin that's going to put up the code for Google Analytics in your page header. So this would be how you'd go about doing it. So you'd have add action, WP head, your function name, then the name of the function, open the curly bracket, and then this is straight HTML. This is actually a straight copy paste from the Google Analytics website. And then I restart my PHP code, close the bracket, and that's it. So what this will do is when the header of the site is generated, it's going to slap this code in your site header. So the nice thing about doing this way, as opposed to putting it manually inside of the header of your theme or somewhere in your functions, is by making this a plugin. Then, as I said before, if you change your themes, this little piece of code is still going to execute. It's still going to put that up in your header. Now, yes, there are many Google Analytics plugins out there, but there might be other things that you want to put inside of your header that you want to just be able to easily keep in there, even if you change your plugins. So this is a fairly straightforward way to do it. And most of it is code that you would already be dealing with and putting inside of your site header, and just a little bit of a wrapper around it. Now, this little page here just shows you all of the basic hooks that would be executed when you're rendering a basic WordPress page. I'm not going to go over all of these, but just to show you that there's a lot of entry points that you can get into as WordPress renders your site. There's all these different occasions for you to have your own code be called. Now, filters work in a similar way. So filters, yes?
Will you be able to get the content and manipulate it? For example, if you have a title and your theme says this title is post name / site name.
That's filters, and I'll get to that in 2 seconds. Yeah. So filters, so here you have add filter. Then you have, first of all, your tag, which is which filter do you want to be called with, or which filtering mechanism do you want to be associated to. Once again, your function, your priority, and your accepted arguments. So here an example would be add filter, the content. So if you want to be able to filter the content of the title of the page, but the title is another one of these filters, then you would register here the name of your function. So filter hooks are going to receive data that you can either look at, modify, completely replace, and then at the end, you need to return data back to the WordPress. So these functions are going to be a little bit different in that they'll need to send something back. Now, if we look at the WP core code, if you look at the content which you might be using on your theme, well, what it's doing inside is it's getting content, then it's saying apply filters. So that's internally how it goes about and just call everybody who's been registered to do something to this data. So if we take a look at the implementation of something like this, if you had here add filter, the content, same thing here, then we have our function. So the function here would receive the content as a parameter, and then it can go about doing anything at once. So if we're thinking still of our Google Analytics example, well, you might want to go and add a little on-click piece of JavaScript on any link you have within the site. So here, I'm not going to go into all the code, but you would be able to look through the content, trying to find an href, and then going in there and adding your on-click event. But if you wanted to manipulate your title, you would do the same thing here. You'd have the title up here, you'd receive the title, and then you could change it around and then send it back at the end with return, and you'd return the data that you've modified. So very simple to be able to do something like that and be able to change some data. Now, some other common filters that I know I've used is stuff like, since 3.0 with the menu builder, sometimes you might want to change things in that menu. You might want to have, for example, a client login link that you created within your WordPress menu. Now, when the client clicks on this and logs in, when he comes back, well, that link might not be the client area. So you could go in, add a filter to go and replace that login link inside of your menu with something else. So different things that you could do there. Once again, this kind of map that's showing all the different types of things. So the title is over here, but there's many other different things that you could look at filtering. Now, this is actually only a subset of all the ones that might be called. It just got a bit cluttered, but just to show you once again, there's a lot of different things that you can attach to within WordPress. Now, once you have this basic thing in place, well, you might want to look at storing options or receiving options from the user to be able to output things that are a bit more tailored. If we think back to that Google Analytics example that I made, well, you could hard code your UA number from Google Analytics, your little page ID in there, or you might want to have your plugin have a little configuration page where you can actually specify what is your Google Analytics ID for your site, and then use that inside of the code when you're outputting that header. So now what we're moving into is, well, how do we store user options? There's a few different ways that you could store user options. WordPress provides some nice APIs to be able to store and get options. So they're called get option and set option. You can use these API calls to be able to store either single variables or arrays of data. Other ways you could do it, well, you could do it with your own custom tables, potentially, to be able to store data. That's a bit more adventurous. Or you might want to go with config files, so going in a text file and typing and, not nice. So I personally always go with the first one. So the syntax for these functions, very simple. Update option, the name of the option, the value. If it doesn't exist, it's going to just create that option in the WordPress table. So this will reside in the options table in your WordPress install, just like any other option in WordPress is stored. And get option would have the name of the option, and then you could also specify a default value. So if your options don't exist, what should it give you back? The default is false, but you could have it return something else. Now, initial options are usually created when you're activating the plugin. So when you install your plugin and you're going to hit that activate button, there's a callback that you can take advantage of, which is the activation trigger. And so there you can do things like put forth an initial set of options for your plugin. So the way you do that is you have the register activation hook function. Now this is a little different than the action hooks we've seen before. What you're doing is you're specifying here a file name. You can see here this is __ file. This is actually a PHP constant that refers to your plugin file. And then you have the name of the code that should be called. You also have deactivation hook. Now, one thing I want to specify here is you should not be using the deactivation hook to delete user data, to delete user options. There are plugins that do that. I can't stand those plugins. Because if you're trying to debug something that's going on in your site, and you're trying to deactivate things to just see which plugin is causing some trouble on your site, well, if a plugin flushes out all your data on deactivation, when you reactivate it, you go, oh, where did all my data go? Where did all my options go? So that is not where you want to do that. I'll get into where you want to do that in a second. But first, an example of activation code. So here, I've registered my activation function, and what I do in here is I say if getOption is false, then I'm going to create an array with an option, and I'm going to say update option, which will create it. As you can see, it's very simple. It's a few lines of code, once again, to be able to do this. Of course, this might grow as you add more options to your plugin, but it's all the same mechanics that you're doing in here. Now, the way you should look at deleting traces, any traces of your plugin or any options, is by registering an uninstall hook. So in recent versions of WordPress, they added also the ability when you're deleting to say, well, do you want to delete everything that's related to this plugin? And so as it does this, it's going to call your uninstall function, and then you can go in there, delete all the options that you've created so that they're no longer there, delete any custom table that you might have created. There's actually a second way to do the uninstall. You can actually create a file that's called uninstall.php. In that case, WordPress would just execute all the code that's contained in that file straight. And there, again, you could have your code that's going to take care of removing your data and doing all those things. So it depends, both approaches work here. So once you have options, well, you want to have your user be able to modify these options. And so that's where admin pages come in. So you've seen, most times when you install your own plugin, you're going to see an extra item be added here inside of the menu. So how do you create that extra item? Once again, it can actually be achieved with a few lines of code. So I can see here the familiar add action. So I'm hooking into WordPress, telling it that when it's building the admin menu, I want to call my own function. And so here, we're going to have my function that's going to call this function here called add menu page. So here I'm going to specify a few parameters. So the title of the page, the label that's going to show up here in the menu, the permissions you need within the WordPress system to be able to get into that page, a short label for this, the function that should be called, and then a link here to the logo for your plugin. Here I'm using a nice little helper function called plugins URL. This is a core WordPress API to be able to build the URL of where your plugin is installed in the system. So you don't have to think about where it is. You can just call this, and it's going to figure out the path. Yes?
I've seen a couple plugins that just not create a single page, but a full hierarchy of different options they can select.
Yes.
Removed from, say, the main column. Is it possible to do it, or do it through ordinary WordPress means, or do you have to?
Yes, it is possible to do it. There's ways to attach menu pages to a parent, and to have your own block to be fully separate. I don't know the exact syntax off the top of my head, but yes, it's possible to do that with core APIs. And so by adding this code here in your plugin, you get this nice little item here in the WordPress admin. Now, once again, right this moment, if you click on there, you'll get errors because you haven't implemented what should happen when you click on that. But still, already, again, some reward, you're seeing something in your menu. And so let's look at how we can get something to be rendered. So we're going to implement our function that's going to be called when you're rendering this here. So what we'll do here in our own function is, first of all, well, let's pick out the options. And then, well, this is straight HTML. Let's put a title. Let's create a form. I'm going to have an input field in here. Let's echo the value of the user option. And then let's put a submit button and close my form. So, if you've built a web page, you've seen code like this at some point, potentially. If you've built a theme, you've seen code like this. And so what I get is down here, my section here in the admin. So when I click that new GA option in the menu, I'm getting this page in place. Now, that's all great, but what happens when the user presses submit? Well, you have to write a little piece of code to take care of that. So you can add over here, there's many ways of doing this. You can actually register something to be called when the page is posted, but I've always found the easiest way. You can go in here, check if there's post data set, and then go and store your option. So that's one approach to do it. There are cleaner approaches, but this will definitely get the job done. The last little detail you want to do on your admin page is to add a bit of security. So what you don't want is you don't want somebody to figure out that you have a certain plugin installed on your site and then try to do a post to your admin from outside of WordPress and have that data be sent to your database. So the way you do that is when you're displaying the form, you add this WP nonce field and you give it a name, and then you check the admin refer if it's going to match. So what that's going to take care of is it's going to make sure that whoever is posting this form was in the admin before. If they weren't, you'll get some vague message about, uh-oh, something went wrong. You might have seen this before when you were dealing with your own website and administering it. And what it basically means is something didn't go the right way in terms of your data on your site. Now, once you've done all of this and you have options and you have the ability to save those options, well, you need to use these options. So just getting back to the little code about the header, I've just made two modifications. One is to go and pick up the options, and the other one is just to insert that ID, that Google Analytics ID, inside the output so that it points to the right one. Then if you're reusing this on multiple sites, you just go in your admin, change your ID, update, and you're good to go. So next topic is Metaboxes. Now, after the previous presentation that talked about all these wonderful plugins to handle Metaboxes, this is going to look ugly, but I'm going to have to go back and do my homework and look at these. But within your plugins, as you're building your admin pages, you can actually use Metaboxes, which are these kind of containers. So basically, the Metaboxes refer to these boxes that you have here across the admin pages. That's what we call a Metabox. So those who were wondering that before, that's what it means. So plugins can use Metaboxes in their own admin sections, or they can actually also use Metaboxes to be able to add custom sections to other parts of WordPress. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So if you want to have your admin page look like this, where it kind of looks like it belongs in WordPress, well, there's a few different things to do. As the admin menu is getting built, you can add a Metabox. And so you would specify here the name of your box, a label for it that's going to show up on top, the function that's going to render it. You have this page hook that you get back here when you create your menu. And then you specify where it should reside within your page. If you're making your own plugin, it's usually going to be normal. And then the priority. The other thing you can do here is call this function here. This will basically tell WordPress to go and load up all of its JavaScript that it uses to be able to do things like collapsing the metaboxes in your admin page, if you've ever done that. Well, this will take care of loading all these scripts for you, this little enqueue script function. Now, once you have this in place, well, then you need to working on the code that was displaying the form. Now, the original code was this little section here. The new code is a bit longer. So, well, maybe this is still a little bit mystifying, but actually, this is just a copy-paste of what's inside of all the other admin pages. So I kind of looked at how things were styled, what kind of wrappers it had in terms of div IDs. Now, after seeing the previous presentation, I think I could make this a lot easier, but still, this is valid to be able to get your metabox up on there. The key function here is called doMetabox, and this will take care of rendering all of the metaboxes that might be up on your admin page. So if you wanted to have your own admin page to have multiple subsections, this one call here is going to take care of rendering all these boxes. Now, inside of each box, then you would specify the code that's going to render what's inside of the box. So specifically, the input field and your submit button in this case. Now, as I mentioned, metaboxes are also very powerful because they can let plugin developers go in and add extra things in other sections of WordPress. So for example, when you're editing a link, you might want to add extra things to your link. And so there, as a plugin programmer, you can go in and say, well, I want to add a metabox with my own name, and this is the function that's going to render it. And then I want to add this to links. So not to my own stuff, but to the links page. And so by doing this, it's going to render your own section over here over in links. Now you can see there's still a few things that appear before it. Basically, this is rendered as high priority as it could be, because WordPress still takes precedence. But then you have your own section that's rendered here. Now if you're going to do this, well, you're going to need to save this extra data. And so I'll get into this, but just to show you primarily that making a plugin is often the same mechanics. What we have to do here to save this extra data is called add action. We've seen this before. So we're hooking into the action, which is adding, editing, or deleting the links. We're writing which code is going to get executed, and then we can go in and save this extra data or retrieve it or delete it. The last topic I want to touch upon is shortcodes. So a lot of the examples I showed so far, so if you want to have extra code in your header of your site or at the footer, well, the next one here is, what if you wanted to have a shortcode that you've created on your site to be able to easily be able to repeat a block of code, potentially have some parameters in that block of code, and then be able to reuse this very often on your site. So the time you want to use this is if there's something you keep copying and pasting a lot of your pages. There's got to be a better way to do this, and creating your own shortcode is the way to do that. So shortcodes, if you're not familiar with them, are going to have, first of all, 2 square brackets and then a string. That string is your shortcode. There might also be options that go with that shortcode. So for example, here, the gallery ID, the size of the images. So that's extra data that's being passed along to your shortcode. These shortcodes are then going to be converted into content when the page is being rendered. So you've probably used this with different plugins that you've installed. You just added that shortcode on your page and then something appeared. Shortcodes can also be used to do styling. So you can also use it to have a shortcode before and after a block of content, and that would do things like style it a certain way or transform it in some way or another. Now the danger with these codes is that very often themes are introducing those codes inside of your WordPress install. Now that means that if you uninstall that theme or change for a different one, all these codes are going to break. So that's one thing to be aware of, that theme-based shortcodes are not good, or you have to be careful with them. So what I would say here is you should consider creating a shortcode on your site, as I said, if you're going to do something very repeatedly. So an example of this would be, well, what if you're inserting YouTube videos very often? And this is just one example, but you might have something a bit more custom. So what if you wanted to be able to insert a YouTube video by saying YouTube vid ID, and that's the ID of the video? Well, the way you do that is by registering your own shortcode. And the way you do that is similar to what we've seen before. So we have add shortcode, the shortcode string, so that's whatever you would want to type on your website, the function that's going to implement it, and then afterwards here you have the function. It receives here these attributes. This is basically your options that you want to have. Then you have this helper function here that will extract these different options for you and stuff them in variables. And then what you can say is build your output and return it to WordPress. Now this is a bit different from the header code that we saw before. In the previous header code, we could just have straight HTML there, because when that was getting called, it was just blasting that right into your header. Here, this is a bit different. WordPress is going to be processing your shortcodes as it's preparing the content to be rendered on your site. That means that it's going to go in and find that shortcode tag, and then it's going to ask you, well, what should I put there instead? So if you just go in there and echo something, it's going to appear at the top of your page, because at that point, WordPress still hasn't figured out everything that's going to be rendered on your site. So what you have to do instead is you put together a variable, you put the information inside of the variable, and you can see here I'm reusing that ID, which is the video ID, and then I'm returning that data. And that's it. So, if I just had a plugin with my header that I've seen before, and just this stuff here, I'd have a custom shortcode in my site, and I could just reuse this, and I wouldn't have to worry about changing my themes. So quite powerful stuff. So what if you want to publish your plugin on the WordPress site? So you've made an interesting plugin, you think somebody might want to use it. That's basically how I felt 6 years ago when I started to do this. I made a first plugin, I'm like, well, I can't be the only one who wants to use this, so maybe somebody else would like to. So a few easy steps you can follow to do this. The first one, well, you register on WordPress.org. Most of you probably already have usernames on the forums on there, but if you don't, then you just register. Second, you submit a plugin name and description. So you go in there, you say, well, I want my plugin to be called XYZ, and this is what it's going to do. Within a couple of days, you'll get a nice email back saying, well, great, hop on board. And so you'll get your approval, and so then you're ready to publish your plugin. So once you have that, the next thing you need to do is create a README for your plugin. There's actually a special syntax that you need to create a README to be able to get published on the WordPress site. What that's going to contain is data like, for example, which versions of WordPress does your plugin support? Because the plugin itself just says which version it is, but on the WordPress side, there's data that tells you which versions of WordPress are supported. So you need to provide that in a README file. You also need to provide a few other pieces of data. It's fairly straightforward. And then what you can do is you publish your plugin to what's called the WordPress Subversion repository. That might sound scary as well. Basically what WordPress does is it sets up this directory for you that will take care of doing version management, so keeping track of your plugin over time as you make updates to it. And it will also all be backed up on your server. So all of this is put up for you on the WordPress site, and then you can use a client like this one, Turtis SVN, to be able to upload your files to there. So you can see this kind of looks like an Explorer window where you're going to see your files. But really, as you're adding files to this, they'll get uploaded to the WordPress server, and it will keep track of every single version of your plugin every time you make a change, and you can go back to the original version of your plugin. It does all that for you. So there's a great infrastructure there for developers to be able to create their plugins, add them onto the site, and then afterwards, everybody's free to download them and get update notifications when you make changes. So that ecosystem is great. So now some recommended reading. So if you liked what I talked about, if you want to learn more, if you want to make your own plugins, first reading I would recommend is this great book that was just published earlier this year, Professional WordPress Plugin Development. It's a 500-page Bible of how to make a plugin. I wish I had that when I started to make my own plugins, because I was searching everywhere for code samples. So great book to read. Next, the Codex. The Codex has a fair amount of examples on how to put together your plugins, how to call different functions. Of course, these are generally very kind of broad knowledge, very open in terms of what they do, but still, there's some great data there. PHP.net. Well, you're coding in PHP if you're making a plugin, and you might have to do things that are a bit beyond what I showed here. So PHP.net has great documentation, great examples on how to program in PHP. StackOverflow.com, I found in doing a lot of my web searches, when I was trying to find how to do something, Stack Overflow just had a lot of code samples. Somebody would ask a question, how do I do this? And so you can just filter on WordPress-related things on Stack Overflow. And then there's always someone, sometimes some of the key WordPress developers or people that have been building plugins for years that will go in there and show you a nice code sample on how to go and do that thing you're trying to do in your plugin. So StackOverflow.com. Today's presentation is going to be on my own site here. So If you want to go on there, I actually have also a PHP file that's all the code that I showed you in here. So this is something that I've been building as I was trying out the plugin and taking all the screenshots. So you could just download this, put it on your site, see what it does, tinker around with it. So that's all available on my website. And so these slides will be on the Wordcamp Montreal site. And on this note, I thank you for attending this presentation on creating plugins or plugin development demystified. You have my email address, Twitter, blog, plugins, all this stuff to reach me. I always love to talk to users or other developers. Have a good day. Sorry, I forgot to ask for questions. Can you create your own hooks? Technically you could, yes, because when hooks are being processed, in your own code at one point you could say do action and have a hook name, so other things could register to that name, yes. So potentially yes. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Are there any Dreamweaver plugins that you would recommend to develop plugins for WordPress?
I'm not that familiar with Dreamweaver. I've tried to use it once as a code editor. Gave up after a while because it was just a bit slow for my taste, but there may be. I'm not knowledgeable about that. So the question was, are there any WordPress plugins, Dreamweaver plugins to be able to create WordPress plugins, and I'm not aware of any.
I've heard of one, but it's a purchased one. It costs money. It's an extension.
And from the front here, there is one out there, but it is a paid plugin. So
I've heard of it. I've not seen it or used it. I don't know what it is.
I know a lot of people swear by NetBeans as an IDE, and I'm about to try that. Right now I'm just using a text editor to edit plugins.
What do you use?
Programmer's Notepad?
Notepad++?
No, it's called Programmer's Notepad on pnotepad.org.
NetBeans is good.
Yeah, and I'll give that a shot. I mean, the main thing I was waiting for on NetBeans was word wrapping. And they just added this in version 7. So I'm going to try it now, because last time I tried, no word wrap, not good for me. Over here?
How do you evaluate what's good and bad in plugins?
How do you evaluate what's good and bad in terms of?
Yeah, when you're evaluating whether you want to install a plugin onto your site, what are the things you look for when you go through it?
Wow, that's a good question. What do I look at when I'm considering to install a plugin to decide if I'm going to install it or not? First thing would be, well, a good admin page with a lot of different sections, that it looks organized. Rating, obviously, is one thing that I always look at, like how many ratings does it have and what kind of star rating does it have on the WordPress.org site. When's the last update? Good point, yes. That's always good to know. Something I always look for as well as a developer is if it deals with jQuery, and the previous presenters this morning talked about that. Some plugins do jQuery right, others don't. So some plugins have their own version of jQuery that just breaks everything. They call it at weird places. So a good plugin that is doing things with jQuery will do it the proper way by enqueuing, making a request to enqueue the jQuery loading, and then have that rendered. So that's another criteria. It's a bit more technical, but that's definitely one to look for.